Zack cupped his hands on the back of his neck and stretched his elbows out behind him. It was his third time reading through his assignment brief, trying to make the information stick. Above the wall of detail, and highlighted in bold, was the personnel request. Mission ID 6212023. Destination Wutai, South Base. Departure Midgar 2300. Sephiroth, Soldier, First Class. Zack Fair, Soldier, First Class. Avery Windward, Pilot. It wasn't the job he'd been expecting. Sephiroth had been tracking Lazard and looking into reports that Genesis may still be alive. Zack had thought that the next time they'd work together it would be because Sephiroth had a new lead, and Zack was still impatient for that call, hoping that it might lead to a few answers. This looked unrelated, but maybe that was okay. He'd heard of the unit that they were being sent to take on. Wutai resistance holdouts and some sort of splinter from the Crescent unit. If they had a name, Shinra didn't know it. And in the absence of anything better to call them, they'd become known within the Shinra forces as Scythes. Essentially, they were assassins. But they weren't above using all manner of dirty tactics, not just against Shinra staff, against their partners, their children, anyone they could levy for a political advantage. These were opponents that were legitimately deadly, and not in a blunt force trauma way that the army could have handled. This was every inch a top-level soldier mission. Even better, the Scythes seemed like bona fide, unambiguous criminals. And that might be exactly what Zack needed. Sephiroth too, probably. A return to a time when everything was clean and easy. Heroes were heroes, villains were villains, following orders was the right thing to do, and friends always fought on the same side. Maybe for once they'd actually feel like they were doing some good. They did all their strategizing on the journey, with the understanding that the approach to the base would require utter silence. It was standard anti-guerrilla prep. Expect to be disoriented, poisoned, attacked from behind. They loaded their belts and pockets with a handful of extra remedies, ropes and grapples, even a couple of daggers in case they needed to dual wield. Neither loved that idea, but it was okay for a surprise attack in a pinch. The base itself was actually quite impressive. Zack thought there'd been some kind of mistake until Sephiroth peeled back a layer of grass to reveal a trapdoor. How the Turks had managed to find this place was well and truly beyond Zack. Probably something to do with that inflated pay packet that Sung was so proud of. There'd be time to wonder about that later though. Sephiroth was already lowering himself silently through the entrance. Trying to tap into what would have been a pretty well-buried talent for stealth, Zack swung his legs through the opening and followed Sephiroth into the darkness. It was quiet. That was the first sign that something was wrong. If there was anyone around, there were none of the telltale lights or sounds, which left two possibilities. Either they were out already, probably torturing the family of some unsuspecting Shinra leader, or they were here, and they knew that their base had been infiltrated. Still, it didn't really change anything. If the Scythes knew they'd been found, the base would be packed up and moved before Zack and Sephiroth had even made it back to Midgar. Even if the Turks could trace them again, they could do a whole lot of damage in the meantime. Apparently on the same page, Sephiroth waved Zack on. Scythes were considered masters of subterfuge, and for good reason. Zack heard the hiss of the grenade long before he sensed anyone else in the room. Smoke billowed around them. "Antidote!" barked Sephiroth, as Zack's hands were already closing around the plastic vial. Sure enough, as the clouds seeped upwards, stinging tears prickled behind his eyes, and a burning itch roared up his throat, even as he tried to choke down the remedy. Okay, that was weird. "Zack," Sephiroth hissed. "Get down!" Zack gasped, his lungs filling. He slammed a supporting hand against his thigh as he sneezed and managed to bend his knees into a crouch, his breaths coming harsh and fast. Half a vial of remedy still sat in the bottle. He breathed deep and sealed his throat, determined to get the rest down, but his lungs shook and shuddered and gasped, determined to resume his rapid breaths. He dissolved into a spluttering cough, followed by a round of furious sneezing. That was when the arrows fell. "Roll for cover," came the next order. There was a playbook for low visibility combat, and Zack should probably have been communicating back, but in that moment it was all he could do to breathe. That remedy had gone down, mostly, but if it was going to do anything about the frantic sneezing, it hadn't happened yet. The first arrow bounced off his shoulder plate. Zack grunted as the metal caved, crushing into his shoulder, but the arrow clattered to the floor. He did roll then, as a whole storm of arrows began to fall around them. If there was cover in the little room, he couldn't see it. The smoke was thinner near the ground, but itchy tears filled his eyes faster than he could brush them away. He settled for rolling to the wall. Back covered, sword ready, stay in a crouch. Yeah, it would be easier to think if that would quit already. At least there was one thing that could be said for the smoke. It obscured the archer's view as much as it did Sephiroth and Zack's. Of course, they weren't having to entirely rely on visuals. Still sneezing, he swung his sword in a wild arc, knocking out another round of arrows by luck more than skill. Zack blinked into the smoke, tears pouring down his face now. Somewhere in the fog he could hear Sephiroth cutting through the onslaught before another surge of itching took his breath away. He stumbled from the force of the sneezing. This would be a really good time to get a hold of himself. If he could just be still, listen for the release of the bows. He clamped his mouth shut, catching a rebellious breath. The burning behind his face raged at being denied, but Zack bit down hard on his lip, his nose twitching irresistibly. Just one more minute. And there it was. Quiet, but he'd heard them. A successive whisper of thwacks and pfft as the next round was loosed and cut through the air. In a second, he'd heaved his sword over his head, tightening his backhanded grip. He lunged, bringing it swooping down in a thunderous slice. This time the swing was purposeful, and 2 arrows snapped on impact, with a handful more hammering off the weapon as it plunged. He landed the movement, absorbing the impact with a bend of his knee, and finally, mercifully feeling safe enough to give a tiny bit of ground to the stinging itch that was fighting to claw its way out of his sinuses. But only one, okay? For a split second, he closed his eyes, trying to will on the sensations he'd been biting back. But then there was another arrow. It had gone through him before he'd even realised it was coming. His yelp came out hoarse and strangled, and he hit the floor with a sickening whack as a second arrow drove into his thigh. And relentlessly, impossibly, he kept on sneezing. Somebody landed on him. He felt their weight before he saw them coming, forcing the air from his lungs and pinning him tight against the ground. They were high on his chest, around his ribcage, but still the pressure in his abdomen sent a jolt of pain through his hip that made his eyes roll back. His head swam in a whirl of smoke and pain and that stupid itch that really ought to get in line. But words from the assignment brief cut clear through all the mess. They will strike to kill, and do so very effectively if given the chance. He breathed, straining against the pressure of the assassin's legs, and drew up his sword with a shaky hand. Then his opponent, already rearing over Zack with a brandished dagger, was torn from Zack's chest and flung with some force against the opposite wall. Just as quickly, a fist around the fabric of Zack's uniform was heaving him up off the floor. Sephiroth! Zack found himself hoisted up to Sephiroth's eye level, his feet scrambling for the ground. Sephiroth's expression did not brook any argument. "Get out of here!" But Sephiroth grunted as he swung his sword with his free hand, knocking a new round of arrows out of the air. Zack could only hang from his grip and helplessly sneeze. That was not a request. Sure enough, they were powering in the direction of the entrance. Zack all but dragged along by Sephiroth's pull. Sephiroth thrust the pair of them behind a door, a shower of arrows clattering into the wood as he shut it behind them. "But you—" "I will cover your exit. You take cover, and you phone for recovery to the base. Do you understand?" "Do you understand?" Zack managed, and Sephiroth heaved him in the direction of the entrance as though he were a rag doll.